Hey everyone, this is the Black Manga Critic here with another video for Fantastic Fridays. So just quickly, I just want to shout out Rob on Twitter for suggesting Gwenpool to me. It's a great comic. I love it. I only read Volume 1, but I'm definitely going to read Volume 2 after I finish making this video. Great stuff. So I'm going to put Rob's link on Twitter in the description box below so you guys can follow him. If he, check out content that, that he has on his Twitter page, or just his tweets, just make a friend, right? Make a contact. So shout out to you, Rob. Thank you for suggesting me Gwenpool. So basically, I'm gonna get into two things in terms of Gwenpool because I'm trying to make sure that my videos aren't particularly long, even if I'm reviewing like a whole volume or a whole series or something like that. But basically, I'm gonna get into one a bit about the art style and what that does for the story and the narrative, and the sort of lessons I think that Hastings is trying to is trying to impart upon his readers, and two, the sort of narrative and the writing itself and what Hastings is doing there with sort of the idea of the meta text and sort of the metaphysical in a sense. So to get into the art, I really love what Bayreuth is doing with the sort of expectations that the reader has for the comic, right? If they haven't read any of the issues before going into the trade. And for me, when I sort of saw the trade, I thought, whoa, this is kind of goofy, But I don't mind goofy. I mean, there's another comic called Space Battle Lunchtime by Natalie Reese. And that's a really goofy, kids comic, but it's an awesome goofy kids comic. It does a lot of great things, with cooking and sexuality and things of that nature, in a way that's really great, and the art style really helps that. So check that out. But back to the comic, I really love what the art style does for it. Right, there are certain lessons I think that Hastings is trying to impart upon us in terms of how impactful are certain narratives, how impactful are particular events that happen in the comics that we read, and how do how does the writing and the art move us or not, right? So I think the goofiness of the art style really sort of works to impart certain types of wisdom on not only us as readers, but I think writers and artists and comic creators. So there's one thing that I really love about the art is that there's a point in which Gwenpool is there are multiple points where Gwenpool is where Gwen is is constantly complaining about her suit, right? Basically the leotard that she's wearing on a nightly basis, right? To fight crime. And that's something I think that the art really improves, right? It strengthens the point that Hastings is trying to make about art that coddles to a particular comic book audience that really desires eye candy. And I think the art isn't about it. It's not about eye candy, right? You're not looking at Gwen's ass or anything like that in some creepo sort of way or anything like that. It's just Gwen is wearing a leotard. It's funny. There's no focus on her butt or anything like that. It's just a funny looking costume, right? And I think art is important in that sense because you don't want to critique a particular thing that happens in other comics and then make the same mistake that those other comics are doing in the same breath. So I think that Hastings and Bayreuth do a great job of avoiding that sort of sand trap or whatever. I also really love that there's a sort of way in which the art informs other issues, how impactful can death be, right? In particular stories. So there's a point where Cecil, Gwen's friend, is basically killed, right? He's killed by Modoc, and for me, I just kind of laughed at it because it was just a ridiculous sort of moment where you're sort of thinking, okay, wow, death really sort of matters, but not really, because we don't spend a lot of time with Cecil. We don't necessarily care about him very much as a character. So when he dies, it's not very impactful. and the art sort of reflects that because like when he dies, it's sort of like a zap kind of, kind of like comedic sort of artful sort of death. That's kind of like ridiculous. Sort of the way in which like if you ever watch like Pokemon or something and Ash is constantly getting shocked by Pikachu, it kind of looked like that. Like it just looked really ridiculous and whatever. And it's like, okay, this guy's dead, and let's kind of move on. And I think that like Gwen is sort of impacted by that death in a subtle sort of way, but that death doesn't particularly affect the reader very much. And I think that like the art really helps to make that well known. So I think that's pretty much all I'm going to talk about in terms of the art. Like there are a whole bunch of other things that I could talk about, but like I said, I don't want this video to be very long. So I'm just going to sort of get into the writing and just like what Hastings is trying to do with the ideas of a meta, with the sort of metatextual and the sort of metaphysical. So basically, if I'm going to go into the metatextual, right, I'm going to be talking about, like the ways in which Hastings sort of uses Gwen as a critique of sort of not only just like comic book writing, but specifically probably Marvel, right? And I think that that's like great because at least like you think like you can see that Marvel can kind of poke fun at itself, and I appreciate that in a company. Like I don't know how like evil Marvel is as a company on the down low or anything like that, but what I do see is that it can poke fun at itself. So that's like that's great in my book. But in terms of the metatextual, right? Like I think I feel like this was published in like 2015 or 2016 or in between like those 2 years, right? Those 2 years, right? But basically, we see that Hastings is sort of trying to say like, okay, if you're going to write a story and if you're going to write a narrative, and if you're going to portray something, like what is that thing trying to do? What is the point of that thing? Does that thing impact the reader in a way that gives it value, right? And I think that like there are points, right, where in particular there's one instance for me that really sort of solidified that point where Batroc is talking with Gwen, and Gwen's just sort of telling Batroc that like he's a character in Captain America's narrative, and he doesn't really hold any intense weight or anything like that. But in the same breath, Batroc asks Gwen like, well, okay, if Captain America is part of like a fictional story and it's part of and this is a perpetual narrative, because if you're looking at Marvel and DC, they're all about perpetual and periodic narratives, right? So Batroc asks a really interesting question in that what impact does Captain America have if he constantly fights a battle that it doesn't seem he's particularly winning, right? Because like he seems to just move from battle to battle to battle to battle, and it seems that like he has this sort of large body of work, but he doesn't really have a particular goal necessarily. I mean, is his goal to represent America? Is his goal to represent the everyday the everyman? Is his goal to eventually stop fighting, right? Like what is his what is the point of Captain America? And I think that in other stories, like I think about like a Miss Marvel by G. Willow Wilson, you can tell like there are very clear points to the narrative that Wilson is writing, right? And there are very clear points to the character that is Kamala Khan. But for me, like when I see someone like Captain America, it's like, okay, what is what are we definitely supposed to get from Captain America? What are we definitely supposed to get from him as a representative, right, of something that he's fighting for, right? So Hastings is critiquing that. And I think that moment is really, really impactful because it sort of says that like, okay, not only is Gwen sort of like trying to figure out, what her role is in this new world and what the role of other, heroes and villains and things like that are, but on a metatextual level, what's the point of some of these Marvel heroes and some of these Marvel narratives that have come out in the past, like, I don't know, maybe, 5 or 6 years? What are they doing? How are they impacting readers? Do they matter? So in terms of the metaphysical, right, we're thinking about like, what does it mean to have impact? What does it mean to sort of exist in a world? What does it mean to exist in in this comic world that Gwenpool is currently in, and what does it mean for us as readers and to exist, and what does it mean for us as just like people living in this world to exist. I think that Hastings does a great job of not necessarily giving us like impactful answers in that sense, but letting us sort of think for ourselves and letting us come to particular conclusions about what like how do we have value, right? So I think there are a couple of points in the comic book in Gwenpool that really sort of force us to think about like who we are as people, whether we matter, and whether there are instances where maybe we definitely don't feel like we exist at all. So the first point I would say in terms of Gwenpool is a point where Doctor Strange, right, helps her, like literally become a individual that exists within this Marvel universe that Gwen right is presently in. And I think that's right, like that's like very much so like not only like sort of meta narrative critique in the sense of thinking about how does she exist in the sort of Marvel sort of multiverse or whatever, or just in the Marvel sort of multiverse or whatever, but also just like how do we as people exist within the spaces that we reside in, right? So for her, like, she basically doesn't exist, right? Because she's coming in here, and it's clear that she's there, right? Physically, she's there. She's got a body. She's corporeal, right? But in terms of everything else, she might as well be, she might as well have never existed at all, right? Outside of her physical existence, because the only proof of existence that MODOK has is videotapings of her moving around, being right, like existing physically. So I think that that's like a great sort of critique in terms of like saying like, okay, like humanity and being a person, it's almost sort of like I don't want to say like Neoplatonic or anything like that. I don't want to get into like too like intense like philosophy or anything like that. But in a way that sort of like you really sort of have to have an impact on the world, on society, right? Almost like a sort of civil humanistic kind of ideal, right? You have to have a particular impact on society. Otherwise, you don't exist. Otherwise, you're not particularly useful. Like, people don't need to acknowledge you at all, right? So I thought like that was really like that idea that like she had to like use magic to become like someone, right? To become someone that exists in that world. And I think like for us, right, we have to sort of ask ourselves like those questions, like do like our professions and the things that we do, like let's say like does my making this video impact the world in any way, and does that mean that I exist, right? Like these are philosophical questions that theorists and philosophers have been asking for a long time, and I don't necessarily have an answer, but I do think that like having an impact is at least a part of what it means to exist in the world, in the space that you're in. So I guess the second thing is, to me, one that's like really impactful is is it like in a different way, right? Is Cecil's death, because like I think like sort of the death like itself in terms of what he represents as a character and the emotional turmoil that a reader is supposed to feel normally at a character's death, right? Like that's usually supposed to matter, but in this text, it doesn't really matter, because just as soon as he dies, like he comes back as a ghost. And whether you're a ghost or corporeal being, right, or anything like that, like you still exist as a character in the narrative. So as a character in the narrative, he's basically back, right? Like it's not as if like it's like he never died at all, right? We can just kind of forget about his human form, because like he still probably has his hacker skills, right? Like he's still very much so Cecil, right? Even though he's a ghost and you can like move through him, that's like neither here nor there. It doesn't really matter. So in that way, Hastings is making like, right, he's also making not only a meta narrative critique, right, or metatextual critique, right, in the sense that, right, we have to think about death in the Marvel universe and death in other Marvel texts and just death in comic book texts, right? Do But I think particularly Marvel because like you know people come back from the dead all the time, so we have to sort of think about the texts that we're reading and wonder like in those texts, does death matter? Does it matter that a character dies if they come back to life? Does that death have any impact, right? And so sometimes yes, sometimes no. But I think at least for me, most oftentimes not really. I mean, sometimes the death already happened before we even started reading the trade, right? I mean, at the beginning of the trade, we learned that someone already died, so that death doesn't really have too much impact. Like in terms of how we feel necessarily, it definitely has impact in terms of the narrative. But in terms of how we feel, not necessarily, right? We may not care about the parents who already died off screen. We may not care about the sibling that died off screen. We may not care about the friend that died off screen. And in terms of the metaphysical, right, we have to sort of think about like, okay, what does death mean like in our everyday lives? What does death mean? What does it mean like if a celebrity dies and like maybe I wasn't a fan of that particular celebrity? Like, does that it's not with that we're asking, does that death matter generally? It's just like, should that death matter to you if you don't have a particular connection or anything like that, right? Because like we don't have a particular connection to Cecil. He's just like a he's kind of really like a whatever character in a very specific sense, right? We don't care about Cecil. I don't care about Cecil, but in terms of how he sort of acts as a tool, as a narrative tool, as a plot tool, right? As a tool that as a metaphor, we have to think about, and as a representative, right? We have to think about like how he matters in terms of sort of critiquing conceptions of death and the concept of death mattering to us, right? In different ways. So I think Hastings does a great job of doing that. Like it really made me think, and I think that I just was not expecting to go into Gwenpool like learning about like learning more at least about like how I feel about meta narratives and metatextual techniques and the metaphysical in general, right? Both on just like a general sort of like conversational level and on like a philosophical, literary, theoretical level. So kudos to Hastings for Gwenpool. So yeah, I mean, I love this comic. Like, I think the first two, right, that are sort of Howard the Duck centered, are pretty good. But once it sort of gets past that, it gets really, really good. And once Modok is introduced, it gets amazing. So, if I had to rate the comic, I'd definitely give it like a solid 4.5 out of 5. The only reason I wouldn't give it a 5 is because like I haven't read volume 2 yet, and sometimes I like to like read other things, especially if it's like a continued comic. I like to read other comics to see like, okay, like will volume 2 change my mind about volume 1's like sort of rank. But right now it's a 4.5 out of 5. It does a lot of great things, and I think that like it just surprises you, right? It sort of like knocks you over the head, and you're just like, man, like I didn't expect that. So, and I love to be surprised, and I love the unexpected. And it was a great read. So I'm looking forward to volume 2. I'm probably going to do that video either next Fantastic Friday, because I also have to review Shadow Pact for another person on Twitter. But I'm definitely going to review Gwenpool Volume 2 at some point. So look out for that. And this is the Black Manga Critic, signing out.